It's Monday, it's 9:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative peer and Times columnist Danny Finkelstein, Shadow Leader of the Commons, Thangam Debonair, staff writer at The Atlantic, Helen Lewis, and author David Skelton. Today, the government sets out the final lifting of lockdown in England.
That's going to be about restoring more of people's freedoms, giving people the chance to much more get back towards normal.
So, are the masks coming off for good?
If they want to be cautious, particularly over the next few weeks as infection rates are still high, then wearing a mask would be entirely appropriate.
The new MP for Batley and Spen arrives at Westminster today. Keir Starmer says narrowly holding the seat means Labour's coming home. Is he right? And is Gareth Southgate right when he says this?
I know that these England nights are nights that bring everybody together, communities, families.
So we are expecting to hear from the Prime Minister later on today about ending COVID restrictions in England on July the 19th. Just to give you a flavour of what's going on elsewhere, in Scotland, all parts of the country are also scheduled to be at level 0 by July the 19th. That's the closest to normality, broadly speaking, and we don't yet know or have a firm date in terms of ending restrictions in Wales and Northern Ireland. Let's just show you the front pages of, first of all, The Telegraph, which is use your judgment on masks, PM urges, and this is the front page of the Daily Mirror. Masks law will be scrapped, facing the future. So we're going to focus on that issue with our opening question to the panel, which is, will you be wearing your mask beyond July the 19th or chucking it away, like one minister we heard from at the weekend, Robert Jenrick? First of all, to you, Danny.
I won't be throwing it away. I'm going to trust the judgment of the medics rather than the politicians. So I'm going to listen very carefully to Chris Whitty. I'm going to try and take my own view of the evidence. I want to do the socially responsible thing. It's not just about me, it's about other people. So I can very much imagine doing it on the tube, in stores when I'm in for a while. I won't be wearing it all the time because I have glasses, and anybody who wears glasses will be so happy not to have to wear it all the time. But that has to be tempered by social responsibility. So I'm going to be doing what the government says. I'm going to be using my judgment, but that means informing it with proper medical and scientific knowledge.
Yeah, and Thangam, what's your judgment going to be?
I'll be keeping my mask. I think there will be times when we want to do things slightly differently from how we are at the moment. However, I really put a plea in for the shop workers and the people who work in restaurants and on the transport system. We're doing it for them as well as each other, and I think it's really important that we take into account not putting them at risk. And so it's going to be a while yet before we chuck away the mask completely. I certainly won't be chucking mine away anytime soon.
David?
Yeah, I'll be keeping my mask. I'll be wearing it where I think it's appropriate. I'll be using common sense. So on the tube, in a poorly ventilated space where there's several people who haven't been vaccinated. So I think just using common sense, wearing it where it's appropriate is a sensible thing to do. And just to say, we've had it relatively easy in the UK. If you look at parts of Asia, you have to wear a mask everywhere, including outside.
Helen?
Yeah, I'll be with Danny. I've never been a massive fan of people sneezing directly into my eyes on the tube. So I'll definitely be keeping a mask there. And also the other thing I've really appreciated, I don't know about anyone else, I've had far fewer colds this last year. So even if it's not protecting you against COVID, then there is a certain level of protection there. But there is also a bit of mask theatre. For example, when you go into a restaurant and wear it to walk to the table and then take it off, that seems to me to be largely pointless. So I think I'll be dropping it there.
All right. Well, of course, it could lead to differences because Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, has tweeted this. I struggle to see how ministers can drop the requirement to wear masks on public transport without causing real problems for some people who are dependent on it. Those more vulnerable to infection or anxious about it will be put in a very unfair position. Rethink needed is the question he poses there at the end. Do you think it will lead to differences, Helen, in terms of parts of the country or different politicians?
I think there is a danger of it becoming a sort of symbol of your politics, which has happened much more in America. You know, it's kind of, do you love freedom? Then you don't wear a mask ever, you know, or, you know, do you hate other people? You know, that's like you're putting them in danger. And Britain has been relatively resistant to some of those kind of culture war messages. So I very much hope we don't get into that situation here. We are largely tolerant of people wearing things, even things that we think are stupid. There was a big craze, if you remember, a couple of years ago, of men wearing like loafers without socks, which I thought was abhorrent. And you know what? We just let it go. Other people make different choices to us. That's the point we should take from this.
Right. David, do you agree? I mean, in America, as Helen's saying, it's become a big dividing line. Do you think it will be the case here too?
Yeah, I'm very glad it hasn't become a big political issue in the UK, and I hope that remains the case. As Danny said, it should be on a medical issue. It should not be a political issue. And I hope that remains the case.
Right. I mean, if we just show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph, in the comments section, pro and anti-maskers are new Remainers and Leavers with the same tribes. The divisions lockdowns have opened up and exacerbated will run for years, Danny.
We've all had to write columns, haven't we? And that's a classic one like that. You can just imagine the thought bubble going off in someone's head when they manage to put those two things together. But I really hope that isn't what happens, particularly because, by the way, a lot of older people voted to leave the European Union, and they're among the more vulnerable people. So it doesn't quite map together those things. So I hope people won't make it a political issue. And, you know, as for Andy Burnham, look, there are lots of diseases. We've always had a situation where people who are vulnerable to diseases might catch other people's colds, and we've just got to get the balance right, and we can't spend the rest of our lives trying to guide against any kind of disease ever being caught by anybody. And so that's why you've got to use common sense as well as the scientific evidence to make this judgment.
But Thangyam, can you see differences emerging if you go round the nations? For example, we've used the obviously Andy Burnham's tweet there, that it could be different in different parts of the UK, and it could lead to some sort of social divisions too.
I think the potential for division is there, but I'm also really hugely appreciative of the degree to which the British people have taken a strong interest and commitment to public health. This has been a public health revolution, I think, over the last 15, 18 months, something that our public health professionals have long wanted. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we all wear masks forever, but staying interested in our responsibilities towards each other, our community responsibilities in public health terms, as well as we move out of this crisis, hopefully soon, into other things like climate change, where we do need a community response and for us to be thinking of each other as well as ourselves. And I'm really hugely appreciative of how the British people have done that.
Right, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of more personal responsibility and people making up their own minds when it comes to these after being instructed by the government for so long. Let's just take you through some figures, because a crucial part of the government's case ahead of ending the restrictions is the weakened link between the number of cases and the level of hospital admissions. These are the daily cases, just over 24,000. That was yesterday, COVID-19 daily cases. If we go on, we can see the number of hospital admissions, patients admitted to hospital. This was, as of Friday, 358. And then the latest vaccination levels, that's of yesterday. You can see percentage of the adult population. 86% have had one dose, 63.8% have had a second dose. Let's listen to the National Medical Director of NHS England, Stephen Powers, and his view on that link.
The NHS deals with pressures all the time, and there is no doubt as hospital numbers rise over the next few weeks, we will have to manage with that pressure. A&Es are busy again as life gets back to normal, but we're well used to coping with pressures. We do it every year, every winter when we see rise infections. So we are prepared. And as you have seen over the last 16 months of the pandemic, the NHS will manage.
Well, that was Stephen Powers. We can talk to Duncan Robertson, Dr. Duncan Robertson, an academic at Loughborough University. Welcome to Politics Live. The link is weakened, then, between the number of cases and hospitalisations, but how much weaker is it?
Well, of course, hospitalisations are always going to follow cases, and we've seen cases go up around 70% this week. We've seen hospitalisations go up around 25%. But I think the really concerning thing is that the rate of hospitalisations is increasing. So it's almost as though you're going along with hospitalisations putting your foot on the accelerator, and you're starting to put more pressure on that accelerator. And of course, the risk is, as we release restrictions, that sort of turbocharges that as well. So what we really need to look at is the rate of hospitalizations, the increase of those at the end of this week. So that's the figure that we really need to look at.
Right, but in terms of the age profile of people who are being admitted to hospital, has that changed?
Well, yes, absolutely. So we are getting younger people, we're getting more ethnic minorities, we're getting more deprived people, we're getting more inner city people. And of course, one of the reasons for that is the success of the vaccination programme has been tremendous, but it hasn't been equal. So if you look at the number of black people who've been vaccinated in the over 50s, it's about 6 in 10, as opposed to 9 in 10 in white communities. So that's a huge disparity. And also you see it in levels of deprivation. You see about the latest figures we have are about 72% in the most deprived, there's 84% in the least deprived. And of course, that's increasing all the time, so they're slightly out of date. But of course, Delta is going to essentially find the vulnerable.
Right. I mean, how long, I know broadly speaking, are people then staying in hospital?
Well, they're staying generally in less time, but of course that doesn't mean that everyone stays in hospital for less time. And we can see that by the number of people in intensive care. They're the sort of long stayers, which is increasing as well. So we're starting, of course, we're seeing cases, then it goes to hospitalizations and intensive care. So we're starting to see these things, and that's why it's very important to look at this growth rate of hospitalizations, because of course these release of lockdown 4 hasn't actually been confirmed. Of course, it's going to be confirmed next week, and there's a lot of time for more data to come in.
Right. So do you think it is too early to say right now that we can get rid of the vast majority of restrictions?
Well, it's obviously a political decision, and the roadmap's always been a political document. There are no numbers in there to say, you know, what's an acceptable rate of cases or hospitalizations. But I think the important thing is, whatever happens, that the government has a plan in case things don't go as well as they might hope.
Right, but then in general terms, we heard from Stephen Powis at the beginning. Do you think, and do you agree with him, that the NHS will manage? It always does.
Well, it depends what you mean by manage, of course, and I think this is always a definitional thing, because the NHS has managed over January, but of course that does mean that people in the queue for elective surgery haven't perhaps had the care that they were entitled to. So the NHS will always manage, but will it manage as well as it could? And that's essentially the thing. The NHS will never break, but the pressure on the system will just get larger and larger. And of course that leads to deaths potentially in its own way.
All right, Dr. Duncan Robertson, thank you very much for joining us. Now, what we are talking about, at least, and Duncan is right, it hasn't been absolutely confirmed, is that the 1 metre plus rule will go. Masks, as we discussed about, will become voluntary. Ordering at the bar will be back rather than just table service, and QR code sign-ins will end. So coming back to this issue, if you look at the front page of the Daily Mail, it says freedom is in your hands now. Personal responsibility, Danny, are people ready for it?
Well, I think if you give people personal responsibility, you have to accept that everyone will exercise their own judgment, and that won't always be the same as my judgment. And so you will see people do things that you think are not responsible. So you have to you have to be realistic about what will happen. But my view is, you know, one of the ways that the NHS might collapse is that we can't afford to pay for it. At some point, we have to accept that, you know, the costs may intersect of doing all these lockdowns and restrictions with the cost of COVID. And I think that's the judgment the government's got to make. So it isn't just the judgment that we've just heard, which is what might the pressure be on the NHS of removing restrictions. You do all along have to keep the other judgment. I've always thought the judgment was clear that we ought to have these restrictions, but now we are reaching a point where so many people are double vaccinated. In a free society, people will get ill and they will die and there will be pressure on the NHS. But there are big advantages to a free society in terms of health and people's welfare as well.
Well, what we really need is more emphasis on the data, and it was good to see Dr. Robertson there referring to the data. He also said politicians have to take the decision, and that's correct. However, we need to see the data properly before we can scrutinise the decisions. I think it's very unfortunate when politicians in government trail announcements like this without us having a good chance to look at what's actually going on. And again, as Dr. Robertson said, there are still figures to be analysed before we get to next Monday. I'd like to see them. If we are to exercise our own judgment, we need to have access to the information so that we can exercise that judgment through evidence rather than just, I don't fancy wearing my mask today. I think that's really important.
But this judgment, to be fair, was a result of the judgment was made a couple of weeks ago when it was decided to extend the period. And at that point, it was explained why it would go to July the 5th, July the 19th, what they expected would happen to the data. Clearly, they've got to look at the data finally to ensure, but we have been assured that that is the direction the data is going in. We mustn't get ourselves into a position whereby even the smallest increase in the danger to people and the smallest risk or even medium-sized risk to the NHS of pressure means that we adopt extraordinary policies, which we have to remember are extraordinary.
But Danny, we do also have to think about what happens when there is extraordinary pressure on the NHS. I mean, there will be people who are suffering right now who couldn't get elective surgery because of the pressure that there was in February and March. And we also don't want to have the downward pressure on the economy that comes about if increasing numbers of people get sick and can't get treated for COVID and other conditions. So it is a tricky balancing act. We haven't got all the data yet. We need to see that before we can understand the decisions.
We just have to remember that what we've done is extraordinary and not start to think of it as normal. And that we're carrying on with the normalities of lockdown and abandoning it for the extraordinary thing of freedom. It's the other way round.
Well, do you think people are ready for that personal responsibility, that level of it, Helen?
I think that there are some people who are still very scared, actually. It's been really interesting to watch the number of people who support lockdown measures. That's been something I think that's consistently surprised both politicians and opinion writers throughout, has been the level of support for lockdown measures. One of the things I'm very happy to see is that the government hasn't really been emphasising, this is it forever, you'll never, Freedom Day is forever, because I do think we should keep in mind that, there is likely to be a spike in winter, as there is with respiratory viruses more generally. And I do think that, I'm concerned about the idea of a big bang and just everything, it's all freedom all the time from July the 19th. That's worrying to me. But I also do think that there has to be a point when you say we can't keep pumping this kind of level of money into the economy anymore. Danny mentioned the NHS said, the court system, backlog of 50,000 cases in the Crown Courts, 450,000 in the Magistrates' Courts. That is people often who are on very serious charges in the Crown Courts, waiting for years to hear what the rest of their life is going to look like. Those are the kind of things that we don't talk about very often, but have been put on ice because of COVID.
David?
What is undoubtedly true is the vaccine has changed things. Little doubt in December, the lockdown was the right thing to do. And I've got little doubt now with so many vulnerable people being double vaccinated that removing lockdown is the right thing to do. And it's also pressure on things like pubs, hospitality businesses, which have been suffering for a long time. Just making sure that they can go back to normal relatively quickly. And even if you look abroad, several places like Singapore, who've been most stringent in their lockdown measures, are now talking about going back to a new normal, as they put it. So we can't have severe lockdowns forever. And now we have the vaccine, we have to look at how we can manage this disease as part of normality. And we can't go to these severe curtailments of freedom forever.
Thangham, you said earlier about the data, and we need to be furnished with more data before decisions can be made. Jonathan Ashworth, your colleague, the Shadow Health Secretary, saying what level of mortality is acceptable to the government? Is there a level that would be acceptable to the Labour Party?
Well, I don't have access to the same data that the government does, and that's why I'm asking for them to share with us and to trust us with that information. I don't think that's an easy decision to come to, but I think the government could do with being a bit more honest about the fact that is something that's behind this. There will be a tipping point for them where they say, OK, up with this we can put. And I think that is problematic when they're not honest with the British people, because that would inform our decisions about whether or not, for instance, we do order drinks at the bar or wear masks on a bus.
Right. Danny, what do you think about those levels, a metric? Does there need to be one?
I've always been concerned from the beginning that we've never had a study of what the costs are in health terms as well as economic terms to lockdown. And without that, it's very difficult to make this judgment. Because my answer to this question, I do think, by the way, if Labour's posing it to the government, should try and answer the question. But my answer to it is, well, when it crosses over with the damage that lockdown has done to people's health And I really feel I don't understand that. And I've been irritated from the beginning that we haven't had that. I think Labour's reasonable to ask, by the way, that the government should involve them in this moral decision. Right from the beginning, I felt that too. But everyone needs to now engage with it.
All right, we're going to take you to Batley and spend the pictures there from last week. It was a Labour hold, a narrow Labour hold. Kim Leadbeater is being sworn in. She won the seat. She's being sworn in later as the Labour MP. You can see her there. It is the second recent by-election that the Conservatives haven't won. That's not unusual for a governing party. So the BBC's political editor posed this question. Batley and Spen, is politics starting to return to normal? Danny, is it?
I think that we've got a normal now, which is a beginning of a rotation of seats in which the Conservative Party is doing better in different kinds of seats than it did before. And this is, I think, another step along that way. First of all, can I just say that I think it wasn't normal because George Galloway was involved in this by-election, and also that we should say that Kim Leadbeater showed amazing emotional and physical courage in this by-election. And so whatever your politics, I think you can recognise that and congratulate her on her victory for that reason. So it wasn't normal in those ways. But it wasn't a brilliant result for Labour, let's face it. They should hold seats that they hold, and they did, but not by much. And that is an indication that there's still this change in the demographics of seats going on.
Thangham?
It's quite hard for me not to smile at the sight of Kim Leadbeater. That seat has enormous emotional significance for the Labour Party, for my intake of MPs in particular. I think it's going to be very emotional this afternoon in the House when Kim takes her seat. Yes. But it was also, I think it was a very interesting election. George Galloway factor was definitely there. That had an impact. I think that it, as Kim said, it was a triumph. The result was a triumph of hope over hate, but it was also a triumph of good old shoe leather. There was a lot of hard campaigning went into that campaign on our side. I've been up and down and on the phones. It was a good campaign. I feel that Kim led it from the front with dignity and with enormous bravery, but also something really special, which is she really understands her communities. She can name each and every one of those towns and villages in Batley and Spen. I challenge any of the other 15 candidates who weren't actually from around there to name them all. Now, Kim doesn't just know what they're called, she knows who they are, she understands their problems, she knows where the pavements are broken, she understands those things, and that's a really good example of the right candidate for the right reasons at the right time. All
right, and we'll talk a little bit more about Labour and the challenges ahead. But David, do you think there's a sort of vaccine bounce that was talked about, and Laura Kunsberg mentions it in her blog? Do you think that's beginning to wane a little bit for the Conservatives?
I think, as Danny said, this was not a normal campaign because of the poison that George Galloway injected into the campaign, which I hope is not the kind of campaign we're going to see in future in British politics. But if you look at the result, it wasn't a very good result for Labour. 3,500 majority reduced to 300, a swing to the governing party during midterm. But it comes also a few months after what we're seeing other realigning election results. So Hartlepool going Tory, remarkable local election results in South Yorkshire, in County Durham, in Northumberland, former Labour bastions electing Tory councillors for the first time ever. And also, if you're looking at national opinion polls, the demographics of national opinion polls, amongst working class voters, the latest YouGov poll had a 17-point lead for the Tories amongst working class voters. So you are seeing this continuing churn. In Batley and Spen, in 97, Labour had almost 50% of the vote. Now they had about a third. Yeah. So you are seeing this shift away from Labour's traditional voters towards the Conservatives, which is a continuing realignment, which I think all evidence shows is speeding up.
Right. Helen, of course, the Conservatives lost Chesham and Amersham, a bit more sort of true blue, as was for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other half of the picture, isn't it? You can talk about the red wall and the blue wall. And for every voter that the Conservatives pick up in seats like Batley and Spen, are they losing one somewhere else? I think that's the question. But I do think, this is, you talk about the normal. Well, I'm not really sure what normal is anymore in British politics. Are we talking about a realignment from economic issues that dominated the 20th century to kind of cultural and identity issues? And I do think that's a real worry. The Conservatives, I felt, were quite complacent during this campaign. They thought George Galloway was going to steam in, take all those votes and take them off Labour. And as we remember from the 2019 election, there was a pro-Brexit independent. They thought that vote would collapse and go to them, and they would just be the beneficiary of all of that. So that, I think, is a worrying sign for them, that strategy didn't pay off in the way they hope. But it also should be a bit of a reminder to the fact you hear a lot from the Tory party that culture and war issues are brilliant for them because it's a dividing line that they're on the right side of with the majority of the British people. But there is a cost to bringing identity and culture right up to the top of British politics. And I think you did see some of that in the Batley and Spend campaign.
Danny?
Well, I'm not in favour of that sort of campaign, and I'm not in favour of the Conservative Party choosing a culture war campaign, because I think in the I don't agree with it, but also in the long term, it's a loser as well, because this country is becoming more liberal, younger, more urban, more diverse, and over time, that will mean that the Conservative Party has got itself on the wrong side of the division it's created. So I've never been in favour of that. Right,
David, do you agree with that?
I think we first of all, we have to address the Labour were playing the culture role in Batley and Spen as well. But I think the most important
for the Conservatives,
the most important point for me is that the Tories won the Red Wall seats in 2019, not on culture, but on Brexit and on promising to level up, on promising to deliver economic change, economic improvement to towns and people who've been ignored for too long. And now they have to deliver on that. If they deliver on that, if they bring economic improvement, then realignment will accelerate. If they don't, then the people who trusted the Tories with their vote in 2019 might think again.
Right.
Which is why I think the most important point is bringing economic improvement to people's lives. And I think culture is secondary to that.
All right, but I mean, Helen mentioned, or she doesn't know what the new normal is, which I think we all share a little bit. But is this the new normal, Danny, which is actually some of the battles now emerging, certainly in Parliament, are coming from within the Conservative Party itself on other issues other than COVID? In the Daily Mail, Ruth Davidson, former leader in Scotland for the Tories, warns Boris Johnson he'll take the party back to being the nasty party unless he reverses foreign aid spending cuts as the Prime Minister prepares to U-turn and offer MPs a binding vote on the issue. And also former welfare secretaries, Conservative ones, are pressurising Rishi Sunak. It's reported the Chancellor about extending the £20 increase in welfare. Is that a sign of normality returning?
Yes, and I also think both parties, you've seen this in both parties, and you're completely correct to say it's in the Conservative Party, so I'm not dodging that at all, because both parties are realigning, and that means that someone like me who might have found themselves completely in the mainstream of what the party was doing 10 years ago is now slightly not. It may be part of the coalition, but slightly not. And that is inevitably you're going to get these arguments. It's interesting, the question of international aid, because actually that enjoys a remarkably wide spectrum of opinion against Ruth and probably my view. So I'm not sure that was the best selected issue, but maybe the Conservative Party's got this problem. How does it deal with both its voters in Chesham and Amersham? Both sides, basically, both ends of of HS2. How do you solve both of those economically? And I don't think a culture war position will close the gap. That's why I agree with David about that. You have to look after your new audience, and that will cause you political problems with other audiences.
Well, we spoke about last week, actually, ahead of the by-election, about what was at stake for Keir Starmer. Narrow win, as we say, or a hold for the Labour Party and its new MP. Helen, will that silence Keir Starmer's critics?
No, absolutely not. I don't think anything will silence Keir Starmer's critics. But actually, let's appreciate for a moment how hard it is to be opposition leader, particularly Labour opposition leader in this country. You mentioned that universal credit story about the 6 former Tory welfare secretaries talking about, the fact the uplift should stay. Well, as someone who spent 10 years saying the level of universal credit is too low, the benefit system is too low, lots of people are in work and still are in poverty, that is not a way to run a society. That position was treated as basically halfway to Stalinism. And now you've got Conservatives saying it's sort of compassionate. And, actually, you know what, maybe we should do that. So you have to acknowledge that he's starting from he's playing the game on a harder mode. Anything he says will be treated as if he's basically suggesting that we should all turn into Soviet Russia. I think that's one thing to take into account. The second is the fact that, that it has been an extraordinary year in which Boris Johnson has been on our TVs every week telling us how he's going to stop us from dying. And I would be, you would have to be the worst government in the world not to have some kind of hope that people hoping that you would do well. But his big question now is whether or not to appease the hard left or whether or not to try and fight and ultimately destroy them. And so far, he's opted for option one. Perhaps he will continue to do so.
Right. What do you think he should do, Thang, if he's got a bit more time? Should he keep appeasing the far left, as Helen was saying, or try and crush them?
Well, I'm not really seeing quite the same picture. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who have been calling for Keir to resign if we lost Batley and Spen. Well, we didn't lose Batley and Spen. A win's a win. Keir's values are enduring Labour values. I'm very proud to serve in his shadow cabinet. The enduring Labour values that Keir supports and embodies are actually present in that universal credit campaign, which, yes, 6 Tory secretaries, former secretaries of state, are saying they support it now, but we've been campaigning on it. We've been the ones making the weather on that. That's been a Labour campaign. My colleague Johnny Reynolds, who's shadow DWP secretary, has been keeping that one alive for months and months. Now, I think these are good examples of the fact that we do know what Labour values are. They are enduring. They go on the ground well. I found that in Batley and Spen. Keir embodies them, and I'm really proud of what we're doing.
Right, but do you think that will be enough to silence the critics? That Helen is talking about, it's not going to end it.
I wonder, because they said, they placed their own bet. They said if we lose on Thursday, he should resign. We didn't lose on Thursday. He's not resigning. We all need to get behind him, because the one thing I know is that I don't want to be a strong opposition only, and I think we are a strong opposition, but that's not the prize. We're supposed to be in government. I want everyone to get behind the idea that we need a Labour government with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister.
Right, I mean, Helena Kennedy, Labour peer, last week said ahead of that by-election that actually he should pose the question, back him or sack him, and that's what he should say to his critics.
Well, I think he's pretty much done that question proud by turning out on Friday with Kim in Batley and Spen to show that he is in charge of the Labour Party, and his words that, we're coming home, which I know is a football reference, which I barely understand, but I think it is current. It's a 96 reference, and what happened after 96 was the 97 general election, which I'm very much looking forward to.
But it was a bit like Scotland's thumping 0-0 victory against England
Still won.
Before they got knocked out.
We won.
To use that football analogy.
We won.
What I'm saying is that I agree with you that the Batley and Spen was not a disaster, but you can't really think it was a great success.
Well, I think the George Galloway effect was definitely there, and I think that in the end, I think even George overreached himself. I was speaking to voters in the last weekend who said, hang on a minute about George Galloway, and we're backing away from him because the hate that he was spreading was just too much for some people. I hope that's not politics as usual.
Right. I mean, Helen, John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor, said that Keir Starmer needs to show a bit more anger. Is that what's needed?
I think some passion, genuinely. He's not the most high energy of politicians, and I think that's something that he needs to work on. He can get quite worked up at PMQs, but his preferred style is a kind of loyally prosecutorial detachment, which isn't particularly compelling in a wider setting than that. I think the problem he has is that realistically, the Corbynite left of the party feel very betrayed. They feel that under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, the rest of the party didn't get behind them, was constantly scheming to undermine them, and therefore they don't feel any loyalty now that Keir Starmer suspended Jeremy Corbyn over anti-Semitism, that they should they owe anything back the other way. And I think that is going to be a running sore. I mean, if you think about, had this gone, 350 votes gone the other way in Batley and Spen, and there was a leadership challenge, the first question that any leadership contender was going to be asked was, would you reinstate Jeremy Corbyn's membership of the Labour Party? And I think that means that, there is still a kind of huge divide running straight down the middle of that party.
Thangham?
Well, I mean, I've been criticised for not supporting Jeremy Corbyn enough over the last 5 years, and yet I served as one of his whips for 3.5 years. I worked incredibly hard to try and get Labour into government in 2 successive general elections in which Jeremy Corbyn was in charge, and yet people criticised me still. I think they have got to get behind Keir Starmer, because Keir is our leader. He embodies Labour values. I would rather have a clever lawyer who knows stuff than a Tory Prime Minister who just bumbles his way through everything. I'm really, really proud of Keir and who he is. I'm proud to serve in his shadow cabinet. I think that those people who are criticising, who are still carping, they really need to see that what we need is a Labour government. This is an awful Tory government that's responsible for a huge amount of suffering, and we need to replace it as soon as possible.
Danny?
Well, it's nothing to boast of to try to get Jeremy Corbyn elected as Prime Minister. I think you were better off boasting about that. I think you were better. Well, you were.
I wanted a Labour government.
Yes, and he would have been the Prime Minister in it. So that, I'm just explaining to you, certainly not just, as a kind of Conservative, but also as a Jew. I found that a very troubling stance. And that still remains a problem for Labour, that people have memories of the fact that they did that. But I think Keir Starmer should play into who he is. Right? He's a very impressive individual in many ways. Right? He's been a very successful Liberal lawyer and also a Director of Public Prosecutions. He should say, look, I could be Prime Minister. You can think of me as someone who could be Prime Minister. I think he often runs away into things that people think to himself, that's not what really you think. This Buy British campaign, I can understand it, but does he really think that? I think he's a global internationalist individual, and it doesn't think that. And so it's a bit like you didn't think Jeremy Corbyn should be Prime Minister, but you were campaigning for him. People can see that and they don't like it, and I think that's probably Labour's problem. By the way, Tories have problems like that too, so it's not exclusively Labour.
This is true. I think my point there was the fact that despite the fact that I had deep misgivings about Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, I still campaigned for a Labour government. I didn't see so many of Keir's critics on the ground in Batley and Spen, and loads of us turned out from across the political spectrum, actually, ordinary members, including some who had supported Jeremy, were there as well. So there was a degree of cross the party consensus about Batley and Spen, but I didn't see it from some of his very loud critics, and I really wish that they would learn now we need a Labour government more than ever, and they need to get behind Keir.
Right, David, in your book, The New Snobbery, you say that there's a values gap between the Labour Party and the people they traditionally represent. What do you think actually was going on then in Batley and Spen? We'll leave George Galloway aside because he's not actually here to defend himself, because in the end it was a local Labour candidate focusing on local issues, so it's not as clear as you would suggest.
The truth is that Labour has been in a downward spiral electorally since 2007. They've lost 2 heartlands in 10 years. They lost Scotland and they lost the Red Wall. And I think the loss of Scotland shows that heartlands do not go back as easily as some people within the Labour Party think the Red Wall will go back. And Thangham talked about enduring Labour values. Now, people in my family, people in the heartlands, used to think that Labour Party shared their enduring values, but now they don't think they do, which is why they voted Tory for the first time ever in the 2019 election. And you are seeing an internal Labour Party report said Labour was now the party of high status city dwellers, as opposed to the party of working class towns, which is why so many working class towns who felt the Labour Party was out of sympathy with them voted Tory for the first time ever, which was a hard decision culturally and historically for them to make. And once that hard decision has been made, it's often very difficult to go back, because Labour is seen as a party of metropolitan cities, the party of metropolitan values, as opposed to working class values. And once that threshold has been crossed, there is no guarantee that working class voters will go back to the Labour fold. And something Keir Starmer has to address is how to win back those heartlands. Because if he doesn't, Labour can't win elections just depending on city.
Right, Helen, do you accept this idea from David that there is a new kind of snobbery?
Well, I'm afraid that I'm somebody who's biased. As somebody who gets a lot of heat on places like Twitter from Labour activists over my views on feminism and gender, I can see the mechanism he's talking about, which is a certain sense from parts of the left that they are better than other people, that they are a sort of priest class to whom revelations have been given and the rest of us need to catch up. And I do think that is something that's absolutely poisonous for Labour. The challenge for Keir Starmer is to talk past that and say, you know what, we're a party that's in favour of racial equality, of giving people a better chance. If you're born black in this country, your chances are reduced as a result of that in some significant ways that we want to address. But we don't necessarily have to demand that you buy into a whole load of sort of symbols and belief in diversity trainings and all this kind of stuff. You know, that's the difficulty. The same thing I think happens with gender. It should absolutely be possible to say, you know what, it's hard to be transgender. There are a lot of challenges in your life you'll have if you're transgender that you won't have otherwise. But what you can't do is say everyone has to put their pronouns in their email signature or they're a bigot, because you're confusing two different things. One, which is a kind of broad-minded tolerance, and the second is a narrow factional way of saying this shows that you're one of the elect, one of the righteous. And that's what Labour has to do. It has to talk past that about its broader values without getting nitpicky and prissy about little tiny symbolic things.
Right, is there a danger, Danny, that chasing working class voters, if I say it like that, from Boris Johnson's point of view, is going to come at the expense of the traditional base of Conservative voters?
Yeah, it could do, because people's economic... And what I worry about is trying to marry the two with a sort of false cultural... sort of cultural warrior position. I'd worry about that. But I think that, you know, what was appealing about David's book was his concentration on this idea of having people levelling up and a one nation Conservative vision and trying to appeal to people in one part of the country that we need to live in one country in order for everyone to live in social stability and collaboration. So I thought that was very appealing. And the other part of his argument, which I found appealing, was the point about snobbery, actually, I'm a metropolitan person, and it was important to read David's argument to understand how other people feel about the things that you say and think. So I learnt from it as well, and I'll reflect on it further.
What's the new snobbery to you then, Thangham? Is it true about the Labour Party and the way David set it out?
Well, I think that the political situation is more complicated than that, as we've been discussing throughout the entire programme. That I have a large constituency, it's actually about twice the population of most, and I have a lot of working class voters who voted Labour at the last general election and continue to vote Labour. They're working class city voters. I also spent a lot of time in North East Somerset in the last election period campaigning for Metro Mayor, which Labour won, and including in small rural towns. Now, it's also true to say we have lost some towns in the last few years, but we've also held on to others. So I think it's much more complicated than that. I think there should be a one nation Labour vision. I think there still is. Whether or not that's getting across is something for us to work on. A one nation Labour vision in which everyone has a decent home, a decent school, there are hospitals when we need them, and people have the chance to go on holiday each year. People's needs are basically broadly in line with Labour values, but we have to make sure the voters are never wrong, by the way. It's not for the voters to have to work out what it is we meant. If we're not explaining things well and if we're not listening to them well enough, that's on us, and we have to do that better.
Right. David, do you accept what Thangham's saying about a connection with working class voters, certainly in her community in the southwest?
I think an important thing for me, the argument I used in the book, was going back to the referendum in 2016, when that was a major political decision driven for the first time in a generation by working class voters. And the response of many was not to say, we disagree with you, but your view is legitimate, we'll implement that. The response of many was to call people bigots, stupid, racist, uneducated. And for me, that is the element of the new snobbery. It's not the old snobbery about whether you call something a loo or a toilet. It's whether you have a sense of national political solidarity, where disagreement is just that. And people have a legitimate sense to express their political opinion. And a part of the reaction to 2016 and 2019 was responding with disdain, not responding with engagement, which is why I call it snobbery. And I think it's an important economic element as well, in the fact you've now got working class jobs are generally don't have the same sense of status and worth that old kind of industrial jobs did. And you also have not enough engagement amongst working people in political class, in culture, in business. So it's important to address that. And for me, it's also important to create millions of new manufacturing jobs to build on the legacy of the old, and also ensure that people have dignity at work, whatever job they do.
Thangham?
Well, I agree that we do need millions of new jobs in manufacturing and in the new green jobs of the future, and that's partly why Rachel Reeves launched our new strategy on make, buy and sell British over the weekend. I completely agree with that, and I think it's really important that we value those jobs. I think it's also the issue of who voted what in 2016. We have now moved 5 years on from that, and I don't think those fault lines are exactly where they're being described.
Right. Helen, we're going to talk about the football. At last, people might be saying, we're just going to show some pictures. There are the players, the team from Saturday. The England manager, Gareth Southgate, has said there's been a lot of division and that these England nights are nights that bring everybody together, communities and families. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm slightly dreading the fact that I think by the time, if we make it to the final, I think Boris Johnson will basically have a kind of huge Harry Maguire tattoo on his chest. I'm just slightly alarmed by the idea that politicians are going to pile into this because they see it as a moment of national celebration. But look, for me, and looking at the last World Cup too, I'm not a football fan, but I have followed the England team for the real reason that I think Gareth Southgate is an extraordinary figure. There's that extraordinary kind of redemption arc from 96 to now. And also just the fact it's lovely to watch an older man acting as a father figure to young guys who are in an incredibly both privileged and attacked position, right? And I think the commentary from the BBC is focused on this. It's really hard to be a professional footballer. You get a lot of money, but you get a lot of hate at a very young age. And he has become a kind of father figure. And just to see him being physically affectionate with those guys, having faith in Harry Kane when he's going through a dry spell, I think that's been really wonderful to watch. So even it's melted the heart of a non-football lover like me.
Oh, well, if it's melted your heart, Danny.
So, look, I think it's one of the things that's striking about this England football team is that it has the values of its generation, which I happen to think are pretty exemplary and rather inspiring values. And Raheem Sterling and Marcus Rashford are examples of that. They're very impressive, and as a group of players, I think they've gained strength as against, say, you might say France has got, theoretically a stronger group of players. But there may be more of a team ethic in the England team. That's partly Gareth Southgate, but partly this group of players who speak actually quite highly about the generation they come from. And I think that's something to be really quite optimistic about.
Right, what about predictions? Come on, you're famous for your modelling in terms of outcomes and scores. What do you think?
We did really, really well to this point, but at this point you've got 4 teams, they're all actually reasonably even. England have got about a 33% chance of winning the trophy at this point, but we're not the best team in it. Probably in terms of results, Spain are.
All right, OK, well, hold on to that. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back at 9:15 tomorrow. Join me then. Bye-bye.